It was a quiet, affluent neighborhood in Augusta, Maine, where everyone knew everyone, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But beneath the surface of this picturesque town lurked a dark secret, one that would shatter the lives of two respected individuals, Matthew and Laura Brooks. They were the perfect couple to the outside world, respected by their community, with two beautiful daughters in an outwardly blissful marriage. Yet, behind the closed doors of their idyllic home, betrayal, lust, and jealousy festered, a tangled web of deceit and infidelity that would eventually lead to a violent confrontation no one could have predicted. On a cold November night, a man's body was discovered in a remote cabin. As the investigation unfolded, a torrid tale of obsession, deadly secrets, and a marriage destroyed by dangerous liaisons emerged. This is the story of how passion and betrayal ignited a chain reaction that no one could stop. Augusta in the fall was a sight to behold, with golden and crimson leaves framing neatly kept lawns and cobblestone paths. In this seemingly perfect backdrop, Matthew and Laura Brooks stood as pillars of their community. Matthew, 45, was the esteemed principal of the town's high school, a charismatic leader who had turned the institution into a model of academic excellence. Laura, 40, ran a successful nonprofit organization dedicated to helping underprivileged children. Together, they were the image of success, love, and stability. They had two daughters, Emily and Sophie, teenagers navigating their own lives within the protective walls their parents had built. From the outside, the Brooks household appeared to be the epitome of happiness. They hosted lavish fundraisers, attended community events, and were often seen holding hands at town gatherings. Yet even the most carefully constructed facades cannot hide the cracks that slowly formed beneath the surface. Behind the doors of their large suburban home, things were different. Their marriage, once vibrant and passionate, had grown stale. The love they once felt for each other had been replaced by routine obligation and, worst of all, distance. Laura often felt alone, spending long hours at her office or out of town for charity events, while Matthew was consumed by his work at the school. The spark that had once lit their relationship had long since faded, leaving both yearning for something more. For Matthew, the longing for excitement came in the form of a younger woman, Rebecca Harris, a 30-year-old school counselor who was intelligent, lively, and everything Laura no longer seemed to be. At first, Matthew's attraction to her was innocent, small flirtations, long conversations after school, but it soon evolved into something far more dangerous. Matthew, tired of the monotony at home, felt a thrill when Rebecca paid him attention. He was like a moth drawn to the flame, unable to resist the pull of his desires. Meanwhile, Laura had her own secrets. David Ellis, a 60-year-old board member of her nonprofit, had been a steady presence in her life for years. At first, their relationship had been professional, but as Laura began to feel increasingly neglected by Matthew, David's charm and attention became impossible to resist. He offered her what Matthew no longer did: admiration, desire, and an escape from her mundane life. While Matthew and Laura continued to present a united front to the world, their secrets simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the perfect moment to erupt. Matthew couldn't pinpoint exactly when his innocent interactions with Rebecca had crossed the line into something more. It began with harmless banter in the hallways, light touches that lingered a second too long, and extended meetings that seemed more about connection than work. Soon, these interactions became something Matthew looked forward to more than anything else. He found excuses to be near her, savoring the way her laughter filled the room, the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke to him. She was younger, vivacious, and full of life, everything Laura used to be, but wasn't anymore. As weeks turned into months, Matthew and Rebecca's meetings became more frequent. Their first kiss happened after a late-night school event. Matthew had driven Rebecca home, and in the darkened interior of his car, their restrained passion exploded. From there, it was as if the floodgates had opened. Their meetings became clandestine, often in the empty classrooms after hours or at out-of-town hotels when Matthew could find an excuse to be away from home. What Matthew didn't know was that Laura was already engaged in her own illicit affair. David Ellis was no ordinary man. He exuded confidence, a powerful aura that commanded attention. Laura had long admired his ambition and success. He showered her with attention and made her feel desired in ways Matthew hadn't for years. At first, it was simply a way for Laura to escape the drudgery of her marriage. But as their meetings became more intimate, Laura found herself entangled in an emotional and physical relationship she hadn't planned on. David was no longer just an escape. He had become a necessity. Both Matthew and Laura, engrossed in their respective affairs, failed to see the cracks deepening in their marriage. They were living on borrowed time, and neither had any idea that their secrets were about to collide in a catastrophic way. It was only a matter of time before the careful balancing act both Matthew and Laura had been performing began to slip. The first sign of trouble came in the form of paranoia. Matthew's relationship with Rebecca had grown intense, and she began to push for more time, more commitment, more of him. Matthew found himself increasingly distracted, making excuses to leave home, lying to Laura about late-night meetings and weekend conferences that didn't exist. Each time Rebecca called or texted, his heart raced with excitement but also fear. Fear that Laura would find out, fear that his perfectly constructed life would come crashing down. For Laura, the affair with David was growing more complicated. David, once the calm and composed older man, had begun to show signs of jealousy. He became more possessive, more demanding. He wanted Laura to leave Matthew to be with him fully, but Laura wasn't sure she was ready for that. The thrill of the affair had worn off, replaced by the cold reality of David's escalating demands. She found herself caught between the life she had built and the life she fantasized about. The tension between Matthew and Laura grew palpable. They barely spoke to each other, except for necessary conversations about their daughters or upcoming social obligations. Laura sensed something was off with Matthew, his absences, his distracted nature, the way he seemed to avoid her touch, but she didn't push. After all, she had her own secrets to protect. It was during one of these tense, silent dinners that Laura's suspicions began to solidify. Matthew's phone buzzed on the table, and she noticed him quickly glance at it before shoving it into his pocket. Her stomach churned with unease. Later that night, when Matthew had fallen asleep, Laura crept into the bathroom with his phone, unlocking it with the passcode she had memorized months ago. What she found shattered any illusions she had about their marriage. The messages between Matthew and Rebecca were explicit, revealing a passionate affair that had been going on for months. Laura's mind reeled as she pieced together the lies, the late nights, the sudden business trips. The rage that boiled inside her was almost unbearable, but she kept it in check, deciding to bide her time. She had her own secrets, after all, and any rash action could expose them. Meanwhile, Matthew had begun to grow suspicious of Laura as well. He had noticed her frequent absences, her distracted nature, and the way she seemed distant even when they were together. One evening, while Laura was out working late, Matthew decided to check her email. What he found confirmed his worst fears. Laura was involved with someone else. The email exchanges between her and David were far from professional, filled with suggestive language and intimate details about their secret meetings. For the first time in years, Matthew felt the sharp sting of betrayal. He had justified his own affair by convincing himself that Laura no longer loved him, but now he realized that she had been playing the same game all along. The knowledge that Laura had been unfaithful lit a fire in him, a dangerous combination of jealousy, anger, and wounded pride. Let's take a moment to discuss this. What are your thoughts on today's case? Share your feelings in the comments below, and thank you for being here as we move on. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far removed from the prying eyes of society. It had been a place of secrecy, a sanctuary where Matthew and Laura had brought their hidden desires into the open. For months, they had both led lives steeped in deceit, indulging in secret trysts while keeping up appearances as a respectable couple in their picturesque town. But things had taken a turn, and the lies were beginning to unravel. Matthew's obsession with Rebecca had grown intense. What had begun as flirtation soon escalated into a passionate, fiery affair. Their stolen moments together, sometimes in cheap motels, other times in secluded parking lots after school, ignited something in Matthew that he hadn't felt in years. Rebecca awakened a part of him that he thought had died in the monotony of his marriage. He had been living two lives, but as Rebecca's demands for more grew, so too did his desperation. Laura's affair with David was equally dangerous, though in a different way. At first, the relationship had given her a sense of control, a secret weapon she could wield over her dissatisfaction with Matthew. But David's charm had turned darker. He became possessive, critical of her reluctance to leave Matthew and start a new life with him. He was older, wealthier, and used to getting what he wanted. Laura felt herself pulled in by his authority, but also repelled by the way he sought to dominate every aspect of her life. Both Matthew and Laura were spiraling, caught in the gravitational pull of their affairs. They had been careful for months, maintaining their suburban image, but cracks were beginning to show. Their once mundane marriage had now become a tinderbox of resentment, betrayal, and jealousy. Matthew began to suspect something was off with Laura. She was frequently absent, making excuses about work trips and long meetings. He noticed the late-night phone calls, the hurried conversations, the way she seemed distracted even when she was at home. One night, while Laura was out working, Matthew went through her things. He found an old phone she had hidden in her desk drawer, a separate device she had used to communicate with David. The explicit messages between them made his blood boil. For Matthew, this discovery was a gut punch. The affair with Rebecca had been exciting, a distraction from his dissatisfaction with his marriage. But discovering Laura's betrayal was something else entirely. It wasn't just that she had lied to him, it was the depth of her deceit that stunned him. Matthew's feelings of jealousy and rage grew day by day, and soon it wasn't just David he hated. He began to despise Laura for her betrayal. He became obsessed with finding out how far it had gone, how long she had been seeing David, and what they had planned for the future. The possibility that she might leave him for David was unthinkable. Meanwhile, Laura was starting to feel trapped. David had become increasingly erratic, sending her text messages demanding she leave Matthew and come away with him. He had become aggressive, almost threatening. Laura had once found excitement in David's dominance, but now it felt dangerous. David was no longer content with their secret meetings. He wanted Laura full-time, and his jealousy of Matthew was turning into something far more sinister. As Laura grew more distant, Matthew's affair with Rebecca became volatile. Rebecca had grown tired of their late-night meetings in the shadows. She wanted a future with Matthew, one that didn't involve hiding and lies. She pushed him to make a choice. Either he left Laura or they were done. But leaving Laura wasn't an option for Matthew. His entire identity was wrapped up in his family, his position as a respected principal, and the image of the devoted husband. The fear of losing everything was too great, and yet he couldn't bear the thought of losing Rebecca either. The pressure mounted, and both Matthew and Laura were headed toward a collision neither of them could foresee. The town of Augusta had long been insulated from scandal. Its residents were accustomed to the quiet rhythms of suburban life until rumors began to swirl about the Brooks family. The first whispers came from Rebecca's colleagues at the school, who noticed the long hours Matthew spent alone with her. Rebecca, always outspoken about her feelings, had begun confiding in a friend about her frustrations with Matthew's reluctance to leave his wife. From there, the gossip spread like wildfire. Laura was no stranger to small-town rumor mills either. David, with his high-profile position on the board of her nonprofit, had always been a figure of interest in the town. His growing possessiveness over Laura didn't go unnoticed. They had become careless in recent months, meeting at restaurants and attending out-of-town conferences together. People were starting to talk, and Laura could feel the walls closing in. It wasn't just the gossip that threatened to expose them. The digital age had made discretion nearly impossible. Laura received an anonymous email one evening with a subject line that sent a chill down her spine. "I know what you've been doing." Inside, there were photos, grainy but unmistakable, of her and David embracing outside a hotel. Panic set in. She didn't know who had sent the email or what they wanted, but the message was clear. Her secret was out. Matthew's affair, too, was on the brink of exposure. Rebecca had grown increasingly impatient, sending him angry texts when he couldn't meet her demands. She threatened to go public if he didn't leave Laura. The affair had turned from thrilling to dangerous, and Matthew was losing control. One afternoon, Rebecca appeared unannounced at his office. She was upset, tears streaming down her face, and threatened to tell everything. Matthew, desperate to keep things under wraps, promised he would leave Laura soon, though he had no intention of doing so. The tension in their home became unbearable. Matthew and Laura barely spoke, each consumed by their own guilt and paranoia. When they did speak, it was tense and perfunctory. Their daughters, Emily and Sophie, noticed the change in atmosphere, but were too young to fully grasp what was happening. They saw the long silences, the missed family dinners, the forced smiles at public events. The family that had once been the envy of the community was crumbling, and no one knew how to stop it. Laura found herself in a constant state of anxiety. David's demands for her to leave Matthew were growing more intense, and his once charming demeanor had turned darker. He became erratic, sending her messages at all hours of the night, accusing her of lying to him, threatening to expose her affair if she didn't comply. But Laura couldn't bring herself to leave Matthew. She didn't love him anymore, but their life was intertwined in too many ways. Their daughters, their home, their standing in the community. The idea of destroying all of that was too much to bear. Matthew, on the other hand, was consumed by thoughts of revenge. He knew about David now, and every fiber of his being wanted to confront him, to make him pay for what he had done. But he also knew that doing so would expose his own affair. The thought of losing Rebecca was unbearable, but the thought of losing everything else, the respect of his peers, his family, his career, was even worse. He felt trapped in a cage of his own making, and the walls were closing in. The night of November 15th was dark, the sky thick with the promise of snow. Matthew had followed Laura to David's cabin, a remote hideaway nestled deep in the woods. He had discovered the location weeks earlier, after finding a note Laura had carelessly left in her purse. It had taken all his willpower to keep his rage in check, waiting for the right moment to confront them. When Laura pulled up to the cabin that night, she was already on edge. David had been more erratic than usual, sending her a barrage of texts that swung from pleading to threatening. She wasn't sure what to expect when she saw him, but she knew she couldn't keep up this charade much longer. Something had to give. Inside the cabin, David was pacing. His mood had darkened, and he greeted Laura with a cold stare. The air between them crackled with tension as he demanded to know why she hadn't left Matthew yet. Laura tried to calm him, to explain that it wasn't that simple, but David wasn't in the mood to listen. He accused her of playing him for a fool, of using him to escape the boredom of her marriage without ever intending to follow through on her promises. Laura's frustration boiled over. She shouted back, defending herself, but her words only fueled David's anger. He grabbed her by the arm, his grip tight and painful, and Laura felt a surge of fear. This was no longer the charming man she had fallen for. This was someone dangerous. It was at that moment that Matthew burst through the door, his face twisted with rage. He had been standing outside, listening to their argument, and something inside him snapped. Seeing David manhandle Laura was the final straw. Without thinking, Matthew lunged at David, the two men grappling violently in the dimly lit cabin. Laura screamed, trying to pull them apart, but the fight quickly escalated. In the chaos, Matthew grabbed a fire poker from beside the hearth and swung it at David. The blow landed with a sickening thud, and David crumpled to the floor, blood pooling around his head. Silence fell over the room, broken only by the sound of Laura's ragged breathing. For a moment, no one moved. Matthew stood frozen, staring at David's lifeless body, the reality of what he had just done slowly sinking in. Laura was in shock, her mind racing as she tried to process what had just happened. She had come here to end things with David, but now he was dead, and her husband was standing over the body with a murder weapon in his hand. Panic set in as the gravity of the situation hit them both. Matthew dropped the fire poker, his hand shaking. Laura, her mind racing, frantically tried to come up with a plan. They couldn't go to the police. There was too much at stake. Both of their affairs would come to light, and their lives would be destroyed. They had no choice but to cover up the crime together. They cleaned up the scene as best they could, wiping down surfaces, removing any trace of their presence. Matthew dragged David's body outside, wrapping it in a tarp and hauling it to the back of his truck. The snow had started to fall, covering the tracks they left behind as they drove to a nearby lake. In the dead of night, they dumped the body, watching as it sank beneath the icy water. Back at the cabin, Laura destroyed any evidence of their relationship. She deleted all the texts and emails from David, burning the letters he had written her in the fireplace. Matthew, meanwhile, disposed of the fire poker, throwing it into the lake with the body. They returned home in silence, the weight of their crime hanging heavy between them. Neither of them spoke about what had happened that night. It was as if they had made an unspoken pact to never mention it again. But the guilt was there, simmering beneath the surface, ready to bubble over at any moment. Days turned into weeks, and the town of Augusta was abuzz with rumors about David's sudden disappearance. His colleagues at the nonprofit reported him missing, and the police launched an investigation. Matthew and Laura did their best to carry on with their lives as if nothing had happened, but the strain was beginning to show. Matthew became paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder, afraid that the police would come knocking at any moment. Laura, on the other hand, was consumed with guilt. She couldn't stop thinking about David, about how their affair had led to his death. The stress took its toll on both of them, and their once perfect marriage began to crumble. Detective Sarah Donovan was assigned to the case of David's disappearance. A seasoned investigator with a reputation for solving tough cases, she quickly realized that there was more to this case than met the eye. David had no history of running away, no reason to disappear without a trace. Something didn't add up. Donovan began by interviewing David's colleagues and acquaintances. It wasn't long before she learned about his affair with Laura Brooks. This led her to Matthew, and it didn't take long for her to uncover Matthew's affair with Rebecca. The web of infidelity was starting to unravel, and Donovan knew she was onto something. But without a body, there was no proof of foul play. Donovan kept digging, following the digital trail left behind by David's relationships. She obtained warrants for the Brooks' phones and computers, and what she found confirmed her suspicions. Both Matthew and Laura had been hiding something. As the forensic team analyzed their digital communications, Donovan began to build a timeline. The texts between David and Laura revealed a relationship fraught with tension in its final days, with David growing increasingly erratic. Laura's texts to Matthew, though sparse, suggested a growing divide in their marriage, one fueled by the secrets they were both keeping. The turning point came when Donovan discovered surveillance footage from a gas station near David's cabin on the night he disappeared. The footage showed Matthew's truck leaving the area in the early hours of the morning, a large object covered by a tarp in the back. It was enough to bring Matthew in for questioning. At first, Matthew maintained his innocence, claiming he had been out driving to clear his head after an argument with Laura. But Donovan was relentless, pressing him on the inconsistencies in his story. The pressure began to wear him down, and soon, cracks began to appear in his carefully crafted alibi. Donovan also brought Laura in for questioning. Unlike Matthew, Laura was more composed, but there was a fragility to her demeanor that Donovan recognized. She knew that if she pushed hard enough, Laura would break, and she did. In a moment of panic, Laura confessed everything. She told Donovan about the affair with David, about the night at the cabin, and how Matthew had killed David in a fit of rage. But she insisted that it had been an accident, that Matthew hadn't meant to kill him. With Laura's confession and the surveillance footage linking Matthew to the crime, Donovan had enough to arrest him. Matthew was charged with second-degree murder, and Laura, though initially seen as a witness, was later charged with accessory to murder and conspiracy. The trial was a media sensation. The once revered Brooks family was now the subject of public scorn and fascination. In court, the prosecution painted a picture of a couple consumed by greed, lust, and jealousy, their double lives ultimately leading to murder. Matthew's defense team argued that he had acted in self-defense, that David had been threatening Laura, and Matthew had only acted to protect her. But the forensic evidence told a different story. The angle of the blow that killed David, the blood spatter patterns, and the lack of defensive wounds on Matthew all pointed to a calculated act of violence. Laura, meanwhile, pleaded guilty to lesser charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. She testified against Matthew, describing in detail the events that had led to David's death. Her testimony was damning, and the jury was swayed by the emotional weight of her confession. In the end, Matthew was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Laura was sentenced to 10 years for her role in the cover-up.